Yes, my name is Johan Micić, and together with Anastasiya Yarovenko, we organized a show in an exhibit in Eschenbachgasse in the first district. And in relation to the additional program that we wanted to design, especially, we thought that this tour would be an interesting additional information on the work of, let's say, two artists presented in a show, Martina, Šimkovičová, and me. And that's why we also introduced two more experts who would have a talk about specific topics from their own perspective.
When Jelena invited me to contribute to this walk today, I suggested that we are going to remember Käthe Leichter. And it's not that Käthe Leichter is actually connected to this site. She's connected to the institution that is now occupying this site. But I will explain why I wanted to meet here. So there are so many contemporary ways of entering the discussion that is hard to choose, but I will start with the following. When you go to the City of Vienna website, specifically the Women's Department website, in 2016 they published a study that is called So leben wir heute. That's how we live today. And that's the echo or the repetition of an early 1930s study that was called So leben wir, that's how we live. 1,320 industrial workers, female industrial workers, report about their lives. And that was, you would say, seminal, groundbreaking study of economy, a feminist economist, Käthe Leichter, looking at what we call the division of labor and how women's work was not just the work they performed as industrial workers, but what was actually theorized as the second shift. And then this kind of study was repeated, as I said before, in 2016. And when you go to the City of Vienna's website, there's a larger publication that you can download, and then you can go also into the imagery that was also on this website, and I can pass it around. There is one example of how she used Otto Neurath's isotype or picture language to actually make the things she studied legible in a very easy way. So you could say it was a very didactic approach that she used in order to make what she studied understood by many or by the masses. She was employed by the Chamber of Labor. As you probably all remember, the Chambers of Labor go back to the year 1920. So that was the year when, in the context of the Austrian Republic, the federal system of chambers of labor was first instituted. And it's federal in the sense that each of the 9 provinces has its own chamber of labor, with, at the very beginning, Lower Austria and Vienna still together. So because they were, in administrative terms, still a unit. And we could have met at Edendorfer Gasse number 7, because that's where the Chamber of Labor actually was at the time. When you go past there, there is actually a monument is a big word, but there is some kind of commemorative installation by Ingeborg Kumpf, I'm bad with names, Kumpf-Müller. She studied at the University of Applied Arts, and the commemorative installation there consists of the initials of Käthe Leichter. And maybe you haven't seen it because the description provided on this website ends with the words that it's actually very hard to see. So it's so transparent that people actually go past and never see it. It's very important to understand that what they are telling us there, even though it's not wrong, it presents an image as if women had had access to education at the time, which wasn't actually true. And the second, you could say, large gap there is that Käthe Leichter was murdered by the Nazi regime in 1942 at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, and that's why I wanted to meet here. So now some of you might probably wonder, so what does this have to do with the Nazi regime? since we are looking at the Chamber of Labor, which opened here in 1959. But also here, when we look at this building, we don't know. I mean, we just stand here. This is a very implicated site, extremely implicated. And we could say that a lot of the infrastructure of the socialist city of Vienna was actually built on sites that were very important Jewish sites, be it former sites of synagogues or, as here, an Aryanized site of the Micić. And that's why I wanted to meet here, because there is a connection we can make between Käthe Leichter, whose 125th anniversary it is this year. She was born in 1895. She was born into a Jewish family in Vienna and had access to education. She attended a school in the district where I live, in the 8th district. It was a school for girls. And it was the school for daughters of civil servants. So when we look at the names of schools, we can also easily see the stratification, the educational and social stratification. And then, as I already mentioned, she started studying law and political science. And during her studies, she also volunteered and worked with children of proletarians and offered free education to them. And when you read through her bio, so when you go on websites that connect, for example, to the University of Vienna, where there is a Käthe Leichter guest professorship that is given to renowned feminist or women's historians, and other websites, you will always find that Käthe Leichter had very important positions within the Chamber of Labor. So that she was the first woman who was actually part of the Workers' Council, so the Betriebsrat within the Arbeiterkammer, the Chamber of Labor, but also that she headed a newly instituted section, the women's section. And it all sounds super easy. So she became head of this, and she became head of that, and she became part of this. But actually there was major opposition because the union world was extremely male-dominated. And they weren't really very happy about women entering their ranks. So another book that I can recommend and maybe can pass around also is Female, Jewish and Educated. And Käthe Leichter is one of the prominent figures being mentioned here. What I want to share with you, and I actually have a list so I don't forget anything, is the names of the publications. Because when you listen to them, they could have been published today. I mean, it's not that they sound out of date or outdated. And particularly given that we are just living through COVID times with essential work being both honored and more exploited than ever before, we are maybe more attuned in understanding this difference between what is salaried work or paid labor and the kind of work that is never recognized in what the GDP is. So at the time when Käthe Leichter did her study on women's labor, so leben wir heute, 1320 Industriearbeiterinnen berichten, the measurement of the GDP was actually invented. So that was in 1934. And that's when mathematicians and statisticians, if that's the word, decided in the US that they were going, because that was just after the Great Depression, that they were going to measure all the outputs generated by businesses on a nation-state level. But what they did leave out was all the unpaid labor. And in the 1950s, there were arguments being made that economists were actually very well aware of that. But they claimed it would be too difficult to collect the data. During her time of imprisonment at Ravensbrück concentration camp, which is a women's concentration camp of the Nazi regime, She actually wrote theater, poems, and literature, and organized literary get-togethers for her fellow prisoners. And I think the reason why I wanted to share a little bit about her work and her life with her is that she is one of the pioneers of innovative scholars bringing together law and political science and economy, but also that she was a very radical educator who worked with proletarians, also proletarian women. She argued that the newspaper that the Chamber of Labor issued should have a column actually written by workers, by female workers, not written by someone writing about the conditions and situations of female workers. And also because she was a very much an activist, I would say an activist scholar and activist politician who, despite a number of different forms of discriminations that in a way intersected in her life. So she was Jewish, she was a woman, but then she also came from a class background that made it possible for her to do different things. And I think in today's terminology, she would very much be considered an ally. So someone who tried to align herself and become an ally with the interests of working class women.
Statistics was already applied there at that time when it was invented, in a sense, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Otto Neurath is quite a specific figure in the tradition of Red Vienna, through the life of whom one can probably clarify also quite a number of specificities of Red Vienna. First of all, this very strong impetus of education, which is even for socialist projects, doesn't go without saying. There are several reasons for that. Some of them are strong reasons and bold reasons, and some of them are very defensive reasons. The bold reasons are the tradition of the Austrian Arbeiterkulturvereine, in which the Austrian labor movement was very strongly rooted. So it was very much about cultural and other forms of education, and you find that in the very strong emphasis of people like Otto Neurath on education as well. And I bring this up because I'm becoming aware of the fact that the IKL is also to some extent represented here, and I like the idea that educational policy has a very strong tradition in Austrian social political.
And especially in relation to Otto Neurath and this model of museums for the workers, which I found very interesting. And
that's what you wanted me to say.
Yes, this is what I wanted.
But the second reason, I want to say a little bit more. The second reason why education and cultural policy has become such a central issue for the policy of Red Vienna in the 1920s is also the fact that we are dealing with an extremely isolated political situation. We're speaking about communal socialism, a little bit like Bologna Rossa in the 1980s, so an isolated structure of highly progressive in the sense of local, communal, city-based politics that in the end do not have the power to spread beyond the city boundaries and change social, political, economic power relations on a larger scale, and therefore having to focus on very specific aspects of politics, particularly being cultural politics and education, because the big economic issues would only have been able to be addressed on a national level, and there we have highly conservative relations of power. Yeah. So this is another reason why education is such central for Red Vienna, and that's not a bold reason, that's a defensive reason, as I would say. In any case, with Otto Neurath, we have someone who's really active on all kinds of fields, coming from the organization of war economy, through which he's been very interested in planned economy, one of the activists and protagonists also of models of planned economy in council republics in Bavaria, etc. But in the idea of a rationalized system of communication. He's also been member of the Vienna Circle. He now finds ways, or is looking for ways, of expressing facts and data in simple educational forms, and this is what we find. And now we finally get to the point where you wanted to have me at the very beginning, in both his pictorial statistics and his educational programs in basically curatorial practices. We have a classical Red Vienna Gemeindebau, communal housing complex, including the inner courtyard, which is, of course, for the bigger ones, the really specific or characteristic thing, that they form their own internal structure of the communal life, of a shared semi-public sphere, which I think is also very interesting, that you have these layerings of the public sphere in Red Vienna. And the second thing that I find important, and which makes it also interesting to look at communal Red Vienna housing blocks in the 4th district, is that in relation or relating to the organization of public space, you have these interventions, these meteorites, so to speak, in all kinds of districts to comment the hegemonic structure of the organization of space. So this is very important if you think about the Karl Marx Hof itself, placed near Grinzing, so the most bourgeois, the most prestigious and posh city quarter of Red Vienna. But it's also interesting here in the 4th district, where you have very, very few classical, original 1920s Red Vienna housing blocks, but you have this one. What you mainly have to think about when you think about the 4th district is old school, classical, imperial, Gründerzeit, bourgeois architecture. What we've seen coming, from the Belvedere, and therefore I think, this is an interesting example for these intervening urban design practices of Red Vienna. Also an attempt to turn around the major appearance, the general understanding of, classical, bourgeois and Baroque culture. And this is another thing that one could say about Otto Neurath, who was very strictly aligned with the Vienna Circle on the one hand, but also the more avant-gardist tradition in Viennese architecture. So he was, to say the least, close friends with Margarete Schutter-Lihotzky. So one of the architects who were also important for the settlers movement, which is interestingly the one that is more strongly aligned with avant-gardist practices, including the work of Adolf Loos and all these kinds of heroic figures of avant-gardist Viennese architecture. He was very close friend with Josef Frank, who built a few communal Gemeindebau projects and who was a big theorist of architecture in that time, but who was also more strongly aligned with the settlers movement. But secondly, Otto Neurath, as a member of the Vienna Circle and as a theorist of certain types of graphic design, information design, he was interested in getting rid of, ornament, decorations in language and in pictorial language. Speaking about the relationship between the avant-gardist traditions in Viennese architecture, Werkbundsiedlung, these kinds of things that we would have to think about on the one hand, and the Red Vienna type housing blocks is interesting, because you would imagine that a big socialist project, a big socialist housing and building project would also clearly allude to an internationalist kind of formal language, but it actually doesn't. In very few exceptional cases, it does a little bit. There's a beautiful building in the 5th district in the Dielgasse, where you have these surrounding loggias, which is a little bit of a classical avant-gardist formal language that you find there. You have the Ernst Lichtblau complex with glass windows, glass tile windows, all the way up on the facade, which is a little bit of an avant-gardist practice. Then you have also in the Matteotti Hof around the Margaretengürtel the idea of these building complexes that are open for traffic, so you can drive through. So you have this idea of movement in architecture, which is of course a strongly avant-gardist idea. But basically, and for that reason this is interesting, you have these castle-like structures, these extremely representative structures in architecture. Here you have it with the with a sockel. Yeah, I don't know what the sockel is in English, but with a classical,
pedestal.
A pedestal, yes, of the building, and of course the structure of these columns. And you have these very finely, really a little castle or chateau-like organized structure of the facade, with this beautiful, nice little and the stairs, introducing a representational area with the sculpture, etc. I'm not saying that this is good or bad, but it's interesting that you don't have this, appeal or this reference to international style architectural language, and that I think is also significant to some extent for the whole project of Red Vienna, that is very, very strongly rooted, as I said before, in cultural policy. And cultural policy, for the Red Vienna movement meant to some extent a type of policy that is also about to bring forward the importance of national culture, rooted in understanding of language, rooted in an understanding of the specificities of a certain ethnic group, which coming from the multi-ethnic state of the KUK monarchy was an ambivalent project. And the idea of the Social Democrats in Red Vienna was that if they were part of Germany, then they would be part of the strongest labor movement on the planet, and that would be good for socialism. But you can immediately sense that there's something highly ambivalent about this. Becoming part of the German national romantic narrative would be progressive, and this ambivalence you find in the buildings too, that are never really avant-garde, never really international in style. Red Vienna is a massive and unique moment of social progress in not just European history. It's one of the unique moments that allowed for a different type of recognition, for a different type of the distribution of cultural, spatial and economic goods on a level that we find very, very rarely in history. So this is the thing that we have to start with. Having said this, we can speak about the ambiguities. Yeah? Okay, so let's speak about the ambiguities. And part of the ambiguities is that Red Vienna, and that's, my take on this is that it's part of a very specific ideological and historical project that, as I said before, is for certain reasons restricted to cultural policy and cannot fully address economic power relations as much as it should have as a socialist project. And being stuck to cultural policy means it becomes very quickly compensatory. It becomes very, very, very quickly milieu-oriented, and it tries to build communities. Communities, especially in the German, Gemeinschaft is a highly ambiguous term, because Gemeinschaft is by definition a non-universalist understanding of community, of collectivity, because it's the ones that it's a group of people that are similar in background, in style, in language, in ethnicity, whatever. And we have this very strongly, even in the Gemeindebau, the idea that communities of culturally equal people are constructed. So that is one of the things that I find ambiguous. But then also, if you look at the decisions and also the turning points in the architectural political development of Red Vienna against the very strongly grassroots-oriented avant-gardist tradition of the settlers movement, you have this turning point in the 1924 years, I'd say, towards the big housing blocks, also a way of administering, working class people more directly, with which you have formal decisions that are regionalist, so specific regional languages, specific regional materials to be used. For me, coming from abroad, this was always a little bit hard to understand. Why would a socialist project be so regionalistic, so specifically Austrian in its style? Yves Blau, one of the main, theorists, writers about Red Vienna, speaks of a social democratic Biedermeier, which is interesting because there is a very strong reference to, this home sweet home attitude, these closed courtyards, and precisely not what at the same time was theorized as avant-gardist international style, cosmic architecture in the Soviet discourse. If you read Lisitsky on modern architecture, you have this idea that socialist architecture would have to escape, from the ground, because it must not be bound to territory. It must not be bound to regional, national specificities. And here you have the very opposite. And that is interesting. And that turning point has many reasons. Yeah, specific reasons that are rooted in the tradition of Austrian socially, probably to some extent, I'm sorry to say this as a foreigner, but also to some extent in the communal and patriotic mindset of Austrian politics in general. Yeah, but you have this tradition that is very strongly directed towards collective selfhood in terms of cultural unity. Yeah. And here we find ambiguities that very directly lead also into nationalist narratives. And as you can see, someone like Karl Renner, who was with many others founding figure of social democracy in the First Republic, very much an advocate of the Anschlussdenken all the way through to the 1930s, highly ambiguous. Yeah, so people who liked the idea that Austria would be reconnected with Germany because of this shared big cultural moment of its opposition to civilizational values by its deeply rooted understanding of true culture. Yeah? There's some confusion over the fact that direct quote I don't have, but more or less literally why so many of the contemporary inhabitants of the housing blocks, of the Gemeindebauten, would be supporters of the Haider Party. Most of you might remember. And I think that is an interesting question. I don't want to estimate the importance of architecture, or the influence of architecture on political ideology. But where is this moment of possibility that a progressive socialist housing project turns in the self-understanding of many inhabitants into something that is, a petit bourgeois, self-defensive national project? Yeah, a very, very strongly community, national, local, cultural, community-oriented element has always been inscribed into these housing blocks.
But do you have some information on who were the workers that had a chance to live in such housing? Who had access to social housing then and now?
Well, there was the Punkteplan also in Red Vienna, which is probably to some extent similar to what you still have, being advantages for people from Vienna, for Austrians, etc. But then certain social needs would give you an amount of points, and if you would have the necessary amount of points, you would get an apartment more easily, at least. But let me speak about something else, if I may.
Yes, of course.
My experience of watching Wir Kinder von Bullabü recently with my kids. There are basically two main moments in European history where social democracy feels like a progressive project. This is Vienna in the 1920s, and this is Sweden in after the Second World War. And this phantasma, or this imagination of progressive Sweden, if you watch Kinder von Bullabü, Kids of Bullabü, whatever it might call, is that it's very, very strongly built upon the idea of cultural homogeneity. Time, ahistoricity, atemporality, and cultural, as I said, homogeneity. So you have these blonde kids in a place that has fallen out of history, for whom that allow you some certain insect assault, that allow you to identify with, and that also allow you to fantasize about a community within which the classes live together in good unity. Der Knecht am Hof, etc. They're all included. And I wonder to which extent the old welfare state, model of thought is dependent on this identification with those who would benefit from your, subsidies, taxes, etc. And this is to some extent certainly also part of the tragedy of the socialist project, and also the reason why in countries that are so strongly determined and influenced, as we see now, by ethnical, racial tensions. The US never had this sense of identification with all the others, so that they would be worthwhile to be supported by the strong welfare state. Yeah. So this sense of social homogeneity, I think, is to some extent inscribed. Bullabü is just one example, into the fantasy of the welfare state project. Yeah.
Actually, I would like to read some parts from a small interview drama. Here a part of their conversation in German, so please allow me to read this in very interesting German. So, wie heißt das? Die Rumpel. Das ist nicht Hochdeutsch. Rumpel, Waschbrett. Genau. Und wir Wiener Österreicher sagen Waschrumpel. Du hast die Wäsche eigentlich so gerumpelt. Bei den ersten Gemeindebauten hat die Waschküche Waschsalon geheißen. Man hat die Wäsche gekocht. Später hat es dann die Waschmaschine gegeben, wo du Wäsche wirklich waschen konntest. Weil die Maschine so teuer war, mindestens ein Monatslohn hat eine Waschmaschine gekostet. Noch mehr, man musste 3 Monate sparen, eine Waschmaschine zu kriegen. Wenn du 200 Schilling gekriegt hast im Monat, hat die Waschmaschine 600 gekostet. So they're talking about like how they actually were living and they still live there. And then one of them says, nach dem Krieg warst du froh, wenn du einen Gemeindebau bekommen hast. Das war ein Privileg. Schon wieder, glaube ich. Es hat immer irgendwie einen Nachruf gehabt, die Gemeindebau, also sozial. Yeah, so they're all talking about the Waschsalon and how this life was, like especially from the female perspective. So die Änderungen sind nicht so schnell gegangen. Also meine Mutter hatte als Höhepunkt in den 65er Jahren so eine Maschine gehabt. Das ist ja Oberschicht, hallo? Ich habe sie mir aber nicht leisten können. Ich habe schon 3 Kinder gehabt, kein Auto und keine Waschmaschine. Und just one more thing where like this kind of let's say diverse group kind of shows itself. So im Gemeindebau, durch man den Raum für alle beschränken musste, das ist aus dem Bürgertum gekommen, wo die Küchen sehr groß waren und wo dann der Herrschaft die Speise serviert worden ist. Nur im Sommer waren die Kinderzimmer zu benutzen, weil im Winter konnte meine Mutter es sich nicht leisten. Wenn ich ein Kind war, haben wir in einer Jugendstil-Villa gewohnt. Die war nicht beheizbar, die war 200 Quadratmeter groß. Wer hatte so was gehabt? So they're talking to each other and you still see these differences between like, something that a bit illustrates I mean, in a sense, this proves that there has been some diversity, in a sense, but not on a, like, let's say, ethnical level, I would say.
Yes, yes.
The way in which the layouts or the floor plans of these buildings, you can read them as an ordering of family life and of what reproduction actually is. And so on one hand she describes, and I think that has to do a lot with other types of governance that have large impacts of what Foucault has called biopolitics, or the ordering of reproduction, not in the sense of reproductive labor like washing the dishes, but reproduction in the sense of reproducing and having babies. And so she talks about the fact that these Gemeindebau floor plans, so the way living was organized was not for large families, but it was actually the so-called nuclear family that was programmed. So that was one thing that she emphasizes. Then she provides a reading that what other researchers like Kohutek and Pierhofer, who are well-known Red Vienna-based scholars, have argued that the transition from these earlier types of even though more invisibilized yet more shared labor in the Basina type organization, where you had more gossip between women doing the work and a more shared labor condition, even though it wasn't necessarily nicer, but it was different. It wasn't as individualized when we come to the more individualized kitchen type situation, which is different from the laundry, which was a collective space. So I think on one hand we see the connection between the floor plans and what is called heteropatriarchy. I think what it tells us is that a rereading of what happens here when proletarian bodies are moved into large-scale housing blocks is more than culture, or it's more than producing a new type of cultural finesse, which was argued was integrated into these large-scale complexes also. But then who has the time to actually attend culture, perform culture, participate in the political assemblies when you have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, prepare food, then go to work, then get your children, and then do whatever laundry and other work. So I think it becomes very clear that there is a gender division of all kinds of activities, not just domestic labor. And that's what I find interesting in revisiting these places, but I also find it interesting in understanding what they perform today and how they are being inhabited, because they're not just legacy. I mean, they're not just heritage buildings. They are lived infrastructure and filled with contemporary conditions.
I asked you to have a look at the art piece of those three workers with the text Es gibt einen Adel, den Adel der Arbeit. I think all of you might have understood what does it mean in English also. Yeah, so there is no need to translate it. We chose this artwork not because of its highly aesthetic and pleasurable qualities, but more of the text and of the ideas and of the historical context which it bears in itself. This artwork was done by Karl Kral in 1939, and the text, if I remember it correctly, was actually assigned to Adolf Hitler. And it says something also to this new class of work which was supposed to emerge and to be judging people by a new parameter. I used it in my artwork, which is shown in the show Multiple Singularities, which is basically a merge of apotheosis of work or workers from the two cities, from Vienna and Bratislava, and the depictions in the video come from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s, and are using schematic depictions of workers in public space, which show work as a virtue which is important not only for the collective but also for the active worker himself, which also use text and equalize our work with peace, work with bread. So that means like they show that the commodified work is bringing actual very real means to an end. And in this context, I want to also mention another art piece by Alfons Riedel, which is called Flückender Bauer, which is in the Wildganshof. The work is shown in the video, which used to have also one inscription, which said "Wir reden nicht, sondern handeln." We don't speak, we act. So this view of work as a virtue should be seen not only as something which is connected to one specific ideology, but more like a general modernity trait, and as a thought that the manual work is opposed to speculations on financial markets and the capital. So this is something which is good and not bad, as the speculations are. One important point which connects the aesthetics of my video with my thoughts on the work is like they happen to be in public space. There is the physicality of the works. There is the scale. We approach them. We look at them. Today, the public space is not only physical, but it's online, it's immaterial. And in the public space of our social media profiles, of the websites we follow, of the Twitter accounts we like to see, we give much less attention to the visual representations, and they are much more interconnected. While we walk through the city and have the context of the very people who walk there, who live there, we can choose our context and choose our bubble when we scroll online the visuals. The notion of work change, and what many HR departments have been facing since the 1990s till today is the fact that we are dealing much more with the knowledge work, but we're trying to organize it with the means of manual work, which is a bit different process with different dynamics. And there comes my other work, which you can see in the show, the diagrams of productivity, which is take on practical books on bestsellers in the field of knowledge management, and which is exaggerating the practices coming out of the effort to organize your thoughts in order not to procrastinate, in order to boost your productivity, which has become the new virtue of today. It's not so important if you work 8 hours or 12 hours, but it's important if you're productive, because in that sense you can work only 1 or 2 hours and be productive and have a better income, and then you're clever and you still can contribute to the society. So I created the space in the show as a more general thought on work through its public depictions. One of the works which is also shown in the video is from the Gemeindebau in the Dürauer Straße in Ottakring, and it's one of the it seems to be the only one in Vienna which is showing the leisure time as well as the working time. This art in public space also shows the schemes of leisure time, which is interesting to see. While the work part shows the classical manual workers doing with Schweißen, with machines, the leisure work is quite petit bourgeois, it shows naked women with kids doing basically nothing, a man playing accordion, So while the work part is very productive, is creating some objects, some things, the leisure time is free, open and uncountable, which is again the question of today, where also our leisure time has become quantified, commodified and brought to competition. We are running not to create marathons, but to compare our running scores with other friends who are using the same app, and so on and so on. We share our pictures of doing Sardaf and comparing who does better, bigger, faster Sardaf and how much does it survive. So, and this is also the point where our organization Robota, Center for Advanced Studies, starts. Robota is an organization which deals with the question of art, society and technology, the way how these three elements coordinate, and there is also a specific take on work and leisure, which we are thematize them in our activities.
What do you think about home office in times of Corona?
I have to say that home office is a very interesting thing, especially in the times of Corona, because this commodification of our time and sleep was brought, in my views, to a maximum, and the fact that home office could be at home and it was a voluntary was challenged by the fact that it was ordered or asked as a polite requirement by your employer, because suddenly you had a free industrial revolution situation of, in case you are having kids, with your family at home and you just can't connect the other parts of your family to the actual activity. They are divided, but at the same time you're being distracted. So you have this pre-industrial revolution family setup, but you have 2020 tasks which are connected to the very machine.
And what is the relation between reproductive labor and home office? Don't you think that there is some parallel now which is happening because we are forced to stay home, at least those who could stay at home or do the kind of jobs that enable them to stay at home, usually better paid jobs? And what do you think about this relation between kind of also in your diploma there was like this work-life balance, how actually work is like a part of your daily life in a sense, so you cannot really distinguish until when you are working and when do you stop working?
Well, what Corona changed is that until Corona you could show that you have the freedom to switch, but Corona made it visible that you don't have this freedom to switch because you are forced to do it. And my work-life balance was dealing with the fact that we don't have this division. It's not a new thing. Like these intersections of work and life have been present also in the life of artists per se, at least in the 20th century, in the contemporary sense. And also that the condition of precarity in this setup of artists has been the new condition, not only exclusively for artists, but for the large amounts of people. While for artists, the classical bourgeois stereotype was that it is a virtue. For the large numbers of people who are not in the art field, it was seen as a problem. So there is a fight of these two prejudices.